in the Global Supply Chain Workshop. Our speakers today are Mr. Peter Adams. He is a climate risk consultant at Acclimatize, and Mr. Joshua Woodbury. He is an associate in Swiss Re in the catastrophe and paralysis team, specialized in flood risks. So we're going to start with Mr. Peter Adams. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to get to join you today in the middle of your week of interesting events. My name is Peter. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the work that we do at Acclimatize, sort of how we do it, why we do it, and then also get a little bit into some of the work we're doing with supply chains and how we try to understand risk management through them. The main idea that our work is built upon is this one. That businesses are always built around assumptions. The environment, that the climate, that the weather are going to be a certain way. Sometimes it's really obvious. In agriculture, we know that if you're going to plant something, you're hoping that the weather is going to be a certain way, that the climate is going to be a certain way year in, year out, that you'll be able to be profitable, have a successful business. You make assumptions about that. But the reality is that almost everything in our economy is built on assumptions about climate. Sometimes it's obvious and direct, sometimes it's much less direct. But the reality is that our energy systems are designed for transmission and distribution infrastructure that is meant to, that is most profitable under certain temperature regimes. The temperature is going to change, their business is going to change. And helping businesses understand that is really crucial, because this is a kind of risk. We don't know exactly what the climate will be in the future, but we need to plan for it. Figuring out the way to manage this is risk management. Risk management, fortunately, is a sort of a set of tools that have been around for a long time. It's a very human thing, too. It's not just a business or a planning tool, but it's something that's deeply human. To look around and say, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. If something bad happens, will I be ready for it? Risk management is looking at that in a concrete way. It's saying, if something bad happens, how bad will it be? How likely is it that this bad thing will happen? I'll talk to you today a little bit about a qualitative risk management approach that we do, and then Josh will go off and tell a little bit more in detail about a quantitative approach. What we do at Acclimatize is we work with all these different kinds of companies. We work in many, many different sectors, because even though all these companies and all these parts of the public and private sector have very different jobs, they have different assets, different operations, almost all of them have an element of exposure to climate change. Almost all of them may see difficulties, troubles, some kinds of loss of value, or even larger issues in a changing climate. And we work with them to understand that through this process we call climate risk management. But this is still a pretty new field. Risk management is an old tool that we've used for a long time, but using risk management with climate change poses many new challenges. And I hope we can talk about these as the day goes on. But the first big one is, how do you talk climate to business? It's a fundamental issue, but most businessmen and women don't know much about climate change. How do we communicate these problems? The next one, how do you get businesses to act before disasters strike? In 2011, really huge floods hit Thailand. And Thailand had been enjoying being sort of a center node for the electronics industry. But when all these supply chains were disrupted by huge floods that happened in a floodplain, now the entire industry globally is thinking, okay, where are our supply chains? Where do we need to place our chip manufacturers to make sure that next time a flood strikes, we'll have redundancy in our supply chain? That's good, they're responding to a disaster. How can we get businesses to think about this before a disaster strikes? How can we get businesses to manage climate uncertainty? Is this something businesses can do? Are they equipped for it? Where do we find case studies? We need examples of companies around the world saying, climate change could be bad for my business, I'm going to do something about it. And then we need them to talk about it. How can we find these examples? And then finally, this is a new field with a lot of potential consequence. Not only the success of businesses and their profits, but also human welfare, human lives. People's happiness ultimately depends on whether or not we can make sure that food systems keep running, despite a climate change event. To make sure that we're able to do this well, we need professional and ethical standards. How can we develop these? Just really quickly then, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how all this relates specifically to supply chains. And supply chains are really interesting. They're such a huge part of our global economy, and they've done so much for us. They are incredible mechanisms for getting incredible value and efficiency, despite using a wide range of companies all around the world. But with all the advantages that come with supply chains come potentially new risks in a changing climate. Because if you have a facility here in New York, and the climate is changing in New York, you kind of know what's going on. You're connected to the place you're in. You see the weather around you. It's where you live. It's the people you know. It's easy to understand what's going on. But few businesses are just in one place anymore. They rely on material and supplies from all over the world. And there's a multiplicative factor here because you don't necessarily have as much information about what's going on elsewhere. You may have less in a different part of your supply chain. You don't know where your suppliers are getting their energy from or their water from. All of these things may hold risk, climate risk. And if we don't have really a thorough way of addressing this, risks may be invisible, we may not see them, but they may come back and hurt us if we don't cut in time. So to try to think through this, I authored a report with one of my colleagues, along with some people at Oxfam and BSR. BSR, if you don't know them, is a sustainability consulting group with offices in the US and China. They do great work. And together we had this great conversation where we said, well, okay, we think this is a big issue, but how can we communicate this issue with other companies? How can we make sure that companies around the world are able to look at their operations, look at their assets, look at their investment plans, look at everything they do and say, where's the climate risk? What do we do? How do we make sure that our business will be successful? Oxfam was involved in this because they see an incredible alignment between the interests and needs of suppliers in developing countries. Oftentimes, smallholder farmers may be making a valuable crop of coffee. This is the only source of income. This is incredibly important to them and to their, not only to their individual wealth, but also to the development of their country. But in a changing climate, coffee is really, really vulnerable. What can a coffee company do to not only protect its supply chain, but also support these smallholders in the developing country who might be at risk? So Oxfam was the people who funded this report because they see a real alignment between the big interests of a huge corporation like Starbucks and a small producer in Guatemala. In this report, we also got to work with these 7 companies who provided really great case studies, but also looked at all the kind of ideas that we had and helped us vet them and make sure they matched with their procedures. These companies are all, I think, leading in terms of looking at climate risk, what it means for their business, identifying opportunities where they can, and moving forward in a way that will hopefully protect their corporate value and also keep them competitive. And in a few minutes, I'm glad Josh is here from Swiss Re. He'll be able to tell us a bit more specifically about what Swiss Re is doing. This guidance, I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit about what this guidance entails. This is, like I said, a very approach. Oftentimes we don't have a ton of data to work with in developing countries. Sometimes we do have a lot of data, but we don't know how to work with it. What we developed, along with Oxfam and all those other partners, was this approach that allows a business to begin talking about these issues, which is a small first step. We need to go more than just talking, but we do have to talk initially, because so little has been said so far. So early on in the guide, we just began analyzing the issues, just talking about what's going on. And then moving on to step 2, as you get a sense of what's going on, developing a strategy, because you're going to have to do something about climate change. You can't just talk about it and forget about it. You need to assign responsibility to your team. Moving on, you begin to assess risks and opportunities, you begin to prioritize actions, and then finally, you take actions and evaluate your progress. And monitoring and evaluation throughout all of this is really, really key. We don't know what will happen in the future. This is risk management. We're trying to figure it out to the best of our ability now. But more evidence is going to come in, more examples will come in, and as they do, we need to update our procedures to adapt successfully. Under each of these steps are many, many different kinds of questions. Questions that are able to hopefully spark conversation between people within a company. The idea, and this is being used now thankfully, is that a corporate leader will say, okay, things are unusual. The weather's been unusual. We need to think about climate change in our team. So he or she brings together supply chain managers, maybe engineers who design products. They bring together the risk managers, and they have a conversation and say, what about this issue? What about recent weather events? They really affected us badly. In a changing climate, we'd expect to see more events like that, perhaps. What would that mean for us? How can we plan for that? The other big thing that the report provides are entry points. All of this leads to a lot of new information, a lot of new connections within a company. But if that company then writes a climate change adaptation report and puts it on a shelf, it's useless. These are questions related to the fundamental aspects of the business. And so the results from these questions need to be integrated into the standard business processes. So throughout this report, after answering your questions, the guidance recommends, well, okay, you've done this. Where does this go? Well, this probably goes into your company risk matrix. Maybe this goes into your business continuity fund. Maybe you need to share this with your shareholders. Figuring out those entry points are absolutely critical to make sure that that the insights gained actually lead to something. Finally, this is all done through a supply chain lens. And supply chains are kind of amorphous things. In this report, we call them value chains. Value chains are sort of a slightly more comprehensive version of a supply chain that includes ecosystems and communities. In our report here, got a little cut off, we have sort of the supply chain structure of 3 tiers. And the goal here is not to map supply chains. They're always different company to company. But we're trying to distinguish between the different relationships that a company will have with different parts of the supply chain. Down at the bottom, within the business fence lines, you have the primary activities, things like assets and infrastructure and operations, the things that a company itself controls. And in a changing climate, if a risk is identified in the assets, the company can do something about it. Up in the next tier, you have all the things that a company depends upon for its functioning, but it has less direct control over. Things like communities, ecosystem resilience, distribution, sales. These are all vital for a company's functioning, but if raw material sourcing faces a new risk, the company might have less ability to respond to it. And then moving up to the top, you have sort of global economy, the larger factors that, again, influence the business at the core and can also be sources of climate risk, but are ultimately quite far out of the control of the company in most cases. What we did in our report is dig deep into each of these and identify the different risks, but also the opportunities that emerge there. And the opportunities are key because this is climate change. It's going to have some negative consequences, but it's ultimately just a change. And some things are going to be good, some things are going to be bad. Sorting through that is really key for businesses. And I think businesses that are on the cutting edge of this are looking at it objectively and saying, we need to understand what the future climate will be, what the opportunities are for us in it, and what risks we can mitigate. So that's for me. These are back to the same key questions, I think. Maybe we can discuss them more later after Josh has spoken. But it's a very new field. There's a lot of uncertainty in it. And there's a lot of really exciting questions and conversations we need to be having. So look forward to talking with you more in just a few minutes. Do you have questions now? Or?
Yeah, I just have one question.
Sure.
In your report, you mentioned that you point out that community risks are business risks. When you discuss with businesses, which is, for instance, probably Swiss-Re or so, this question may also address to you, how easily do they integrate this observation, the fact that community risks are a business risk, in their strategy?
It's always different, and that gets to sort of the first question of how you talk about climate to business. And so the first thing we always do is really just listen a lot. We talk to people with kind of open minds and say, what do you do? What are your values? And I'm trying to make the point today that this isn't about reputation. This is about good business. This is about addressing the material problems that a business faces. But there could be a reputational side to it. And business recognizes that supporting a developing community, keeping them strong and resilient, is good for PR, then the company can do that and at the same time be supporting the supply chain and at the same time be supporting the community. It doesn't have to be either or. So sometimes that can be a sort of a useful avenue for getting our business on board.
Yes.
Sure, if it addresses
Just a question about the guide. Do you make a distinction between startup companies, so how you actually evaluate the risk management in startup companies? And of course, it's different. The investment and even the location, for example, the supply chain may vary according to the direction of the territory and the future provisions of climate change and the impact of that for a particular sector. And for example, Starbucks that will not actually take in really much risk management because already has locations, industries, distribution companies already installed. So it will be more about the investment part. So have you made this division of what could be a risk management for different in an evolution chain, in a startup? I think it's quite important to distinguish the two.
That's a great idea. I mean, we don't distinguish between startups and established companies, but you're right.
You can actually put it in a business model. I mean, the provision in 10 years, where you could actually start considering, for example, climate change, or a big company like Starbucks, that maybe, or a company that can be quoted on a market. You put that in the information pamphlet that you have to give to the board of administration, and that can be the reputation of the company. So you can see how the risk management that is a great idea in climate change can be diversified according to the state of the company.
Yeah. No, these are great ideas. That's something I'd like to think about more actually. One thing we have done a bit of, which might have some overlap, is in a different report. We did very similar advice for small to medium-sized enterprises, which, I mean, in many cases may be a startup and maybe trying to build bigger. And you're right. I mean, a small company that's just getting its feet on the ground will have different priorities and have different capacity. So in another report, we tried to establish what can a small business do, because small businesses in particular, I mean, they're incredibly important. In every country on earth, there's a huge chunk of the economy, and in many countries, they're the majority of the economy in terms of the number of people they employ, especially. But they're also the most vulnerable in many cases. They just they don't have risk managers, they don't have a lot of money in the bank, they don't have the ability to plan 5-10 years in the future. But when something does happen, they might be the first one who are washed away.
Any indication from it? The samples of business models that you can find on the internet say, how can you get your disaster management risk before you start? So maybe the location of your company would be in a different position where you thought it might actually be, because you know that the territory might be affected by that particular. So helping those little companies and as well as big companies saying, okay, there will be a climate risk, so maybe you should invest in that project or invest in new technology or cups, Starbucks cups, maybe different materials, because you need that distribution coming lines.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's somebody else back there.
Just to tie in, I mean, there's some work, I work with a lot of young people developing projects and ideas. One of the things that we try to do with governments and other companies is the idea of sustainable development. So not only seeing what your climate impact is going to be once you start your business idea or your project, but also like what's going to be the impact in the community and all that. So trying to help them see the overall idea when they're starting up. So I mean, there are some programs all over that are starting to look at that, not just climate, but kind of how the overall impact of what you're trying to do is going to be, not just to make money or create jobs, but the other stuff, like the products that you're going to have, like the whole connecting the dots. So if you want to know more, we can chat later, but yeah.
Super.
Josh, want to take the floor?
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, there's a point there too. It reminded me. So big companies like Coca-Cola or something, they're starting to water. Water is a big one of their raw materials. They're starting to put water on their balance sheets. So now stakeholders and investors are aware of the fact that water is a big part of it. I mean, everyone knows drinking water and Coca-Cola, but now it's becoming very much this. We have to maintain to make sure that we have to treat it well, and we have to treat the people well, that we take it from or use it from. Right? So
Just internalizing the externalities that normally don't have to be.
exactly, right. It's not about just the costs, right? There's is water available? Is it not available? How do we make it available? Okay, so I work at Swiss Re, and so Swiss Re is a reinsurance firm. So basically, what reinsurance? Where's is it hiding?
It's there. It's just off the edge of the screen.
Okay, so I work at Swiss Re, and Swiss Re is a reinsurance firm, and so what that is it's basically insurance for insurance companies, right? It's just one more layer to spread the risk higher. And so the big, what really touches reinsurance are certain bigger events, catastrophes, right? So everyone here has auto insurance, right? But the likelihood is that not everyone's going to get a car accident at the same time. But also everyone has homeowners insurance, and the likelihood is that not everyone's house will be caught on fire. But what if it does? Well, if it does, then that usually it's too much for the insurance company, and they spread it to the reinsurance company and diversify the risk globally. That's the basic idea. And so what really hits reinsurers are natural catastrophes. And so Swiss Re has a team of scientists, engineers, and we develop these models for floods, earthquakes, and wind. And so I happen to be a flood guy. So I took a bit of a different approach. My background is in civil engineering, and I have a PhD in systems analysis, so I have a very systems kind of approach to things. And I think very much this is how insurance companies think about risk. And I think it's cities and the private industry has thought about this for a while, I think, but cities are starting to think about it this way too. So basically, what do you think about it as an insurance firm? And it's basically this sort of integrated risk management approach. So it's a very systematic way to think about the risk, right? A risk is a house, a risk is you, a risk is your car. And so what is a system? Well, the system could be the house, the system could be the car. So there are a bunch of different components, right, that make the car run. Right? You need the engine, you need the brakes. Well, maybe you don't need the brakes, but you know what I mean, right? So there's a bunch of components that come together that make the car work. Same as this table, right? So you have some legs, and two of the legs or one of the legs went out, the table will fail. So this idea of things, everything's a system. You know, the human body is a system. Right? The heart has to beat, and so on and so forth. So an insurance firm thinks about this system and how this system can fail and how you can mitigate it. So, for example, if I'm the New York City mayor, I think, okay, well, what can happen in the idea of transportation? Well, one of the bridges or tunnels could be blocked by an accident or something else, right? So you've got, it's pretty bad for the people that are trying to get across the bridge. It's terribly frustrating to sit in traffic for 2 hours, right? So what can happen? That can happen. Well, and you might also want to think about what's the next impact, right? So if a bunch of people are pissed off, maybe I'm not the mayor next time, right? So sort of this systematic kind of, this might happen, then what can happen, and so on. And you can think about this for anything too, right? So if you want to travel somewhere, do I take a plane, do I take a car, do I walk? What can happen in these different scenarios? If I take a plane, if I take a car, maybe the plane doesn't take off, it's late, maybe the car crashes, maybe I get too tired and I can't really get to where I'm going. So it's an identification of what can happen, what can go wrong. And an assessment is the next big step. How bad can it be? Well, how bad can it be if the plane doesn't take off? Well, you might miss your appointment to wherever you're going. How bad can it be if the car crashes? Well, it could be pretty severe, right? You could hit people, you could hit a bunch of people, and it could be part of a bad accident. You know, and if you're too tired and you don't make it, maybe you fall and scratch your knee. That's terrible, but it's not the end. So this assessment, so how bad can, whatever can happen, how bad can it be? Right? The next sort of thing about mitigation, how can I reduce the impacts of this happen? So for example, if I think of the bridge being blocked, well, maybe I can route traffic a different way. Maybe I can send them to Tappan Zee Bridge or down to Lincoln Tunnel. And that would probably be too long, but it's a method. Right? Or I can open up 3 lanes going into the city and only 1 going out. Right? That may mitigate the impact of noise. And the same, I mean, a car, right? So if a car crashes, you have airbags, you have a bumper, and these are all meant to mitigate the impacts of a crash. And you can think of it as a, right? So a flood, right? Big floods. How can I mitigate the impact of floods? Well, if my house is flooding and I know a lot of the problem is contents, I move the contents to the second floor. Or I move the house up first. So I try to raise up the house instead. Try to mitigate the risk of an impact. So a 2-foot flood may not impact me anymore, but I've sort of eliminated maybe 90% of the flood risk. So the third part is adaptation, right? So how can I deal with the impacts? So it's going to happen. Something's going to happen. The 500-year flood, the 1,000-year flood will happen, and it may reach my second floor. Okay. In that case, that's kind of a tragedy, right? So do I build a third floor and put all my stuff on the third floor? And maybe not. Maybe I think about transferring my risk. Maybe for that extra 10% or the 5% or the 1% that you have to protect for, you transfer your risk. And that's where insurance comes in, right? So you're transferring your risk for when you buy car insurance. So I'm saying, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I don't get an accident. I'll have a brake system, I'll have my brakes checked, I'll have an emergency brake to make sure that's working, make an inspection. But I know something will just ultimately go wrong, right? Just because it's in the scope of what can happen, right? So how can I deal with that? I could put a bunch of money in the attic and leave it there, right, for in case anything floods, like I say, or I can transfer it. So this is very much how insurance firms think about it. And I think this is a really good, simple example. I mean, where do we have sociologists? Do we have engineers? What's the kind of who did social studies again, or social engineering, sociology, correct, science. Anything else? Haven't thought.
No.
So some of you might be, this is a bit obvious, but I think it's very, very key to think about things in a system. Right? So if you think of the global supply chain and trying to work with a company, you think of the system, right? So if I'm building something and part of the raw material needs to come from Thailand, or it's coming from Thailand, I think maybe that's part B in my system. Right? So I can go from A to get to the end. So if I know that it has to be routed through Thailand, and Thailand has a big flood risk, well, maybe I should think about doing something different. Right? So you can think about this in any kind of scenario or sense. Maybe this is my brake system. Maybe B is for the brakes, right? So I just have the foot brake. And so just any type of system like this. So the question, I guess, is if I imagine this being my system, how can I increase the reliability? So these RA, RB, and whatnot are reliability. So how reliable is each of the components? And I know that they're working in series, so this is even a basic example is your Christmas lights, right? So if B goes out, they all go out. Now we have better systems, but that's the basic series system. So how can I make this a bit more reliable? Well, I can increase the reliability of component B, right? That's the least reliable system. And if I have more money, I can go to A. And if I have even extra money, I can go to C, right? So this is sort of ordering and assessing my risk, right? Where I put my money, my resources, and whatnot into fixing it. So there's other ways to increase it, right? So maybe I've increased it the most I can get, and it's still only 0.8. Put a lot of money in it, it's still kind of a crappy system. So maybe I make a redundant part. And so A has to go, it either goes from A to B, A to D, and then to C. So I've added some redundancy in the system. Right? So this is another way to mitigate my risk. So I had to increase the reliability, I just added another component. Right? So I think this is a water system. Maybe I start here with a reservoir, and the piping system, the treatment system, and ultimately I want to get it to people. And so I think, okay, my pipes are maybe kind of crappy, so there's a low reliability, and if this breaks down, the whole system breaks down. So maybe I can't increase the reliability, but maybe I can set up a redundant piping system. So if B goes down, D works. And if D goes down, well, I'm in trouble, but it's lower than likely it's lower, right? So this has a substantial increase in reliability. We go from 0.71 to 0.5. So this is a very basic introduction to reliability systems. But I think the real key here and the real message is that insurance firms and systematic risk managers really think of things as a system. I think the global supply chain is a system, business is a system, where things come in, where things go out, and so on. I have one more. So this is an example of, this is maybe my expected loss over time. I expect to have this yearly loss. I have this amount of budget to capture things from here below. Maybe I have $100 million to do something to increase and build better levees, but I need an extra $500 million to get way up here for even stronger levees. Well, maybe that's too much, or I can't afford that, or there's no political will to do that. Well, then let's take these more extreme events and I transfer the risk. And that's it. So very sort of basic idea of how insurance firms thinking about it, or risk managers thinking about risk. And I think that everything is, Peter's whole talk was I was thinking about systems. I've been very much ingrained to think everything is a system. What can go wrong? How can I make it less likely to go wrong?
Okay, well, thanks a lot for this presentation. In terms of Swiss Re business?
Yes, I mean, if you have a question about actual reinsurance, I just
What part of, like, I guess you deal with plenty of different types of risks. What part of your business, what proportion of your business is related to climate risks, and how has it evolved in time? Like, for instance, since mid-20th century?
Sure, I think, so especially big, there's two major reinsurers in the market. There's Munich Re and Swiss Re, and they're both very big on this sort of more knowledge company, and we can sign this idea. Peter's come across quite a few of my colleagues talking about this, and they're really pushing it. I think they've been pushing it for 20 years or so, this idea of climate change and how this might change everything. And part of making things insurable is making sure that the people that you're trying to insure understand the reduce bills. Right? So the example is the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. You've probably heard of it, right? The real problem is sort of adverse selection, which means the people that need it buy it, which is absolutely opposite of how insurance works, right? You need to diversify the risk. So if you can say, okay, well, you need to do this, this, and this, and then you're insurable. And then also think about climate change. So, I guess to answer your question.
Well, my question was more about, like, during the whole, well, among the whole range of the risks you may insure, the proportion of climate-related risks. I mean, I guess with climate change it grows, but in which proportion? Like, is it like did it come from 20 or 50% of the business, or?
So a big part of it is North Atlantic tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons, right? And so if you assume that those are increasing, then you can say, well, New York City is more at risk, these coastal cities are more at risk, and that's where our population is. Right? People are moving to cities, sort of coasts. So that's a big increase, and it's not only this weather-related change, but it's also just a change in the distribution of risks. Right? People are moving to cities, people are building around cities, and cities are getting bigger, and so you get an increase in what you're having to insure.
Any other questions for Peter or Josh?
Okay, just another question. I quite don't understand at what level Swiss Re insurance works. Is it at a governmental level or just private companies? For example, in the case of a hurricane, Hurricane Sandy and New York, for example, who will come to insure the damages? Will they be the companies, or the United government can ask you, for example, to insure the damages if you enter the city? I'm not quite getting the.
Sure. So mostly what reinsurers do is they insure insurers. So an insurer will have a portfolio of houses, right? And then they're going to have thousands of houses. And then there's some distributions of expected loss for major hurricanes, and then that will be sent up to a reinsurer. And then so the reinsurer's client is often the insurer, the primary insurer. But there are also parts of Swiss Re that work exclusively with the governments, and they say, okay, so we'll set up some risk transfers, so if you pay some premium, and a hurricane category 3 occurs, or some amount of rainfall occurs, or some earthquake magnitude occurs, we'll give you a payout.
And the bottom insurers actually insure lower on national catastrophe. And then the reinsurer is it happening?
Yeah, sure. So if you think it's very much
In New
like,
York, for example, that every 50 years we have hurricanes, so there's going to be a risk of having a hurricane. You still insurance damage. And then you reinsure your.
yeah, so, right, so, I mean, earthquake, you can still, earthquake's not a great example, but a flood insurance system that works, right? So, you know, individual houses can be flooded by sewage backup, it could be rain, or if you have a massive river flooding or something like this. So if you capture, so an insurance or a primary insurer, you know, client that you insure you would deal with, can take this single risk. But if something happens where it captures you and all your entire neighborhood, then that's millions of dollars, and this is that higher level that the primary insurer isn't going to be able to have, doesn't have enough money. And so they say, okay, you know, if you take the top 20% of my maximum loss, I'll pay you some premium. And so they kick in and say, well, it's very much like a deductible, right? So an insurer would have a deductible, like you have a deductible for car insurance or something.
You know, digitization, privatization of titles.
Sorry?
You know, like one of the causes of the finance crash of 2008, the fact that you changed the nature of.
Where you actually sell your clients and also insurance clients. So it's actually your reinsurance an alternative to the exchange of credits caused by insurance clients.
Yeah, so,
Or do you use this essentially to put your insurance client in the market on natural catastrophe?
so basically, the specific answer, I'm not sure. But generally, if you can transfer a risk, insurance can be involved. So what you're doing, right?
That is actually
A
part
risk
of
transfer.
insurance.
So a financial exchange is often some form of risk transfer.
But imagine there's a really big natural catastrophe and they're asking you to exchange the titles on the insurance. You may not be able to pay all the risks. There could be another financial crisis caused by the insurance parties.
Maybe. I'm more.
It's not another catastrophe.
But yeah,
It could be.
any type of risk transfer is insurable. It's insurance.
It's a brave new world. I mean, trying to figure all this out. Like a good example is 2 years ago, the city of Chicago and the surrounding area finished a study. They had somebody like us come in and do a big study and say, where is the vulnerability, climate vulnerability in this whole area? And the report said, well, there's going to be a lot of flooding in the future. The next year, there was terrible flooding and a lot of damage in about 100 like small towns and cities all around that area. This year, the big insurer in the area went to the city of Chicago and is suing them for hundreds of millions of dollars, saying, you had this report done, you knew there was going to be a lot of flooding, and then the flooding came. And it's this incredibly big question because the report was done, the report turned out to have some good insights, but what can the city do? The private insurers all around there, I mean, this is the first year insurers, not like Swiss Re, of course, but they're in all this trouble now. And so I guess that leads me to a question for you. I mean, your customers are insurers, basically. Is Swiss Re putting on a lot of pressure to these insurers to turn around and put pressure on their claims to their insurance policy holders? What is your relationship with them, and what is it like? I mean, are they sort of on the same side as you? Are they skeptical about this?
Climate change.
Yeah, dealing with climate change is part of their work.
Yeah, I mean, there are some big insurers that work quite closely with Swiss Re and Zurich is an example, and you know, these partners in the long run will. But much more, I guess, I'm not sure. You know, there are some people that reinsurance can often be just a commodity, right? So you just pay for it, whoever's cheapest. And so Swiss Re kind of tries to sell clients that say they only want also Swiss Re's knowledge. So you try to build a partnership, but then there's people that kind of go in and out of the market, it's commodity, and you know, these people that look at reinsurance as a commodity. So it really depends, I guess, on the particular insurer. And I think the thing is that, you know, people talk about insurance not paying out. I mean, from the insurance side, it's very much you try to estimate a risk based on a bunch of parameters, And so if you somehow change those parameters, or you don't give all the information that you have, it's an easy way for insurance companies to say that, well, you didn't give me all your information, you changed the game, the probability is different, premium's different, why should I pay? That's fair or not, that's the perspective. Probably where this came from.
Yeah.
And in case you have to pay the insurance, are you paying directly to the insurers, or that money going directly to the clients of the insurance? Are they delegates? Have that delegation for their clients, so they're actually contracting with you in the name of their clients, or are the direct investors that are taking the kinds of investments in the case they are getting money from the insurance?
So you mean from the
chain,
from us
yes.
to the primary to the
Yeah,
reinsurance?
who's
So
taking the insurance money? If the little investors that came to you to reinsure their insurance, or are the direct clients?
So reinsurers only work with the insurers. So there's
Yes.
usually
Yes, but do they work as a representative of their clients, or they work personally as insurers, or they're getting your money directly? Because you can always work as a delegate for the client, so like you're in the insurer because you're the intermediate works for the client, the money goes directly to the client in case something happens, I should say.
No, I mean there's very much a wall between.
Okay.
The reinsurers don't often know their clients.
Okay.
And insurance is often like, here's the book, here's the portfolio, and they have very granular, not really detailed data. Will you insure it? I mean, well, maybe. You know, insurers don't, or reinsurers don't often insure claims. Okay, so why are you guys interested in this section? I mean, what's perspective you guys know interesting in here?
Well, for example, I found really interesting the first steps that you mentioned of the assessment of risk, because I can relate it like when you work with local governments of, for example, little towns, and they want to involve risk management in their plans, development plans, and they don't know how to do it. I found interesting that those first steps could really be a good way for them to identify the risk of their town. Well, I thought that this session was going to be like more like risk management in land planning or something. But I related like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, insurers, what they do is risk management, right? They've been good at it for a long time, that's what they do, because, right? And firms like computers are probably out for exactly to transfer this idea. It's not from insurance, but this idea that risk management is important. And how do you anyone else?
I have a question / comment. You mentioned in your presentation and asked the audience what kind of backgrounds we all had. And I was wondering, from your experience, from your professional experience, both of you, Peter and Josh, how important is it to have professionals from different backgrounds working in the field of risk assessment and risk management for the purpose of a consulting firm working on specific projects, or for the purpose of a reinsurance company? How important is it to have, if important at all, to have people from different backgrounds that will address an issue or a challenge from a different perspective? We have social scientists, we have science students, economists, lawyers. So is it important, and what does it bring to the table to have this diversity of backgrounds and knowledge?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think as you saw from our presentations, there's different ways of doing risk management. And what Acclimatise is doing is trying to build off of what Josh and his colleagues have been doing for decades. Where we think that we add value is we go into a situation where, in many cases, there may not be a ton of data on what a community values, what a business needs, or maybe there is data, but it doesn't capture everything. So what we try to do is paint a whole picture of what the risks might be. And that was a big part of that Oxfam report. Because it's not just about the loss that a business might experience, it's the loss of an ecosystem that a neighboring community might depend upon. there aren't dollar figures for all these things. So the risk management we try to do will look at all of these from a qualitative perspective, maybe with some quantitative support. Towards that end, to answer your question, again, it's key for us to have a very diverse team to try to understand all these different perspectives. So on Acclimatize staff, we have engineers, we have policy people, we have economists, we have social scientists, a wide range of different kinds of scientists who understand different systems. And so for us, it is key to bring all these different perspectives together, try to paint a whole picture of all the potential impacts and risks that a system faces. But I think there's some inherent disadvantages to that because we are dealing with qualitative issues, and different people take different or put different values on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I sort of came out of an undergraduate engineering degree, and I thought, well, I just put a bunch of engineers in a room and we'll solve all the problems. But that's absolutely wrong, right? So, I mean, social scientists, economists have completely different perspectives than engineer work. I mean, this is very much how I think about things. I think a lot of engineers think very similar. And so, that's nice if you want to get an agreement. Probably bad if you want to solve something. And so, right, I mean, it's really, we have tons of discipline from everyone, right? So how do you think about it? How do you analyze it? Different angles. And you know, in a scenario where you don't have perfect data, like maybe I don't have the perfect pointing reliability of that B component, but maybe someone has a perspective that I don't. They can say, well, this actually makes it a little bit better. Great. I agree.
Yeah, actually, I was quite curious about the risk management. Like, I'm working right now in the drought project in the South Dakota, and so you mentioned drought as well in some over there. So when I talk with the cattle farmers here in the South Dakota, they have a lot of drought problem since a couple of years, and so I'm wondering how they can use the risk management approach to post that scenario. So.
Yeah. I mean, are these sort of large agribusiness?
Yeah, they have two large agribusiness.
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, there's, within that guidance that I was talking about, there actually is a whole separate section for different sectors. One of those sectors is agriculture, agribusiness, and working with cattle would probably fall under that. I mean, there's certain key things that they would need to think about, and yeah, I mean, you know, ultimately, I think a lot of these people have the answers. Like they have the answers in their head, but they haven't thought about it in the right way, and they haven't posed the right question. They're not holding their key staff to account for these issues yet. So that's what the guide is, try to say, okay, you're the boss. What do you need to be asking your employees about these issues? And for them, it would be, yeah, there would be issues related to water, to temperature, ways of thinking through the immediate problems that are happening right now, but also think a little bit beyond and say, okay, we have this immediate issue now, it might be an issue in the future, let's figure that out. But let's not get too distracted that we ignore something else that might be going on too. Yeah, I mean, there's potentially a lot of applicability. But yeah, and did you say you were going to be able to share the link? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So because we were flexible with registration, maybe not all of you had originally registered for the session, but we have some readings that Josh and Peter have shared to support their presentation and as a follow-up for all of you if you're further interested in the subject. So these will be they will be shared with you whether or not you originally registered for the session. We just couldn't do it beforehand because we wouldn't know exactly who would be sitting in the room today, especially not as we changed plans.
Not to worry. I mean, yeah, you should take a look at it and send me an email if you have questions about it.
I think like agriculture and other business, there is quite two difference in the agriculture and the rest of the business. Like agriculture is completely dependent on the natural things, natural parameters kind of. So risk that management in the agriculture sector is quite not that possible, right? Quite not effective, I think, than the other sector.
Well, I mean, there's certainly unique challenges, but there's also the benefit of a lot of awareness. I mean, agriculture, more than most sectors, is really full of people thinking about weather and climate. That's an advantage, I think, that you have a lot of really smart people already engaged in these issues, where in another sector, they work in telecommunications right now, they don't think about the weather at all. But they need to, and that's part of my job in this project. So there's an but I mean, I think there are things you can do. I mean, we did a piece of work in Turkey last year, and it was really high level. We did a lot of research, looked at a lot of different sectors, but it was really clear, all the climate models agree that water is going to become a bigger issue in Turkey over the next few decades. At the same time, agriculture is a huge sector there. It's 80% of the economy. It's massive. They export a lot of it, and it's really important to the growth of this middle-income country. It's clear that right now, if they want to maintain this, agricultural strength, and they want to address these water issues, they need to start making investments in irrigation infrastructure now. There's, existing technologies that are out there. Making those choices now will really position companies extremely well, so that in a future climate, they'll be able to survive it well. So there are things like that can help. But yeah, it's always context specific. You always have to look at what your resources are, what your goals are, what the limitations might be.
Sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have a question. Like, how can we use this risk management topic for encourage companies to help communities that are like vulnerable communities that have high risks about climate change, that are in high risk? How can we encourage companies to help them, even though they don't serve directly to their business? We try to drive that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough issue, and ultimately, most companies, I mean, we can only expect so much from companies. I think there's an important role for nonprofits and development banks and national governments to step in where companies will fail, because some won't help. Some will, though. I mean, there are good examples out there. I was talking about coffee companies before and how it's in their benefit to support their suppliers, to make their suppliers more resilient. I have heard examples, though, of companies that haven't been able to successfully help the supplier because coffee grows in very specific climate conditions, and already it's changing in some areas. So you'll have a community on basically a slope of a mountain. That area where they've lived has always been great for coffee, and now it's not as good. Now people up higher on the mountain are able to grow coffee. So the coffee company is going uphill, basically. But at the same time, they're looking back and saying, okay, we're never going to work with that company again. Sorry, not that company, that community again. They can't grow coffee. We're a company. But I have heard examples of the big corporations saying, we're going to help find a different suitable crop for that community that we're leaving. We're going to help them and train them in another cash crop that they can export that will hopefully replace the income they had from coffee. And that is pretty much just them being good people. I mean, they're not, I know about it, but they're not talking about it too much. It's not part of their big PR. So there are some examples, but it's a risk. I mean, and ultimately, I think that is the biggest problem with climate change, is that we have tools to adapt. We have risk management tools. We have a lot of science. We have a lot of knowledge. And no matter how bad things get, the big companies, the big cities, the big, the wealthy countries are going to find a way to figure it out. But poor communities, small companies, poor companies in developing countries are going to suffer more. And that's just a really big problem that I think, thankfully, development agencies and other sort of nonprofit groups are beginning to recognize and beginning to spend a lot of time and money on how they can help them.
I have a question for Josh. As a reinsurance company, you have a good overview or understanding of the insurance market, obviously. Since Sandy in New York City, which has changed a lot of the conversation on urban resilience, it's definitely made it more prominent, and a lot of people that were maybe thinking of climate scientists that they were alarmists or that were denying the potential threat of climate change on such a big city as New York City. Well, since then, it seems to have, entered people's minds and speeches and the debates, and it's no longer something we question. do you also see that in the on the insurance market since Sandy, people are more or less conservative, or are they more proactive? Has it changed the space? Because we know how much Sandy has cost to New York City. We still believe that the figure is quite conservative.
Sure. So there's this thing called the insurance cycle. So there's a soft market and hard market. It depends on how much capital is available, what's going on, what prices of things. But a big question is actually what can change this? What type of event can sort of kick prices up, or so on and so forth. So I think the short answer is that the insurance industry kind of already knew. At least most of the big reinsurers, Swiss Re, Munich Re, ours, it was not really a surprise. And I think the only thing that can really change the idea of something is, for example, the floods in Thailand really changed the idea of the system, because you started to introduce this global connectedness that people hadn't really thought of. The insurance company hadn't thought about that very well. And it was sort of this whole crap kind of moment, we need to reassess. So it takes very much these events, big events that maybe weren't imagined before. So Katrina might be another one, just because Category 3 was expected to be able to, New Orleans could resist the Category 3 because of the levees, but the levees broke, right? And the whole other thing's broken out. And so we didn't expect these breakdowns. The Category 3 was entirely expected, right? So, or not. We didn't know it was coming, but it's well within the range of possibilities. So I think something really has to change. So 9/11 really changed the idea of what the risks are. And so it's very much changed the public's view, but I'm not sure Sandy really changed the reinsurance. It's made it maybe easier to sell reinsurance and stuff to firms, to cities, but I'm not sure it's actually changed very much the insurance idea. Yeah.
I have a question talking about Sandy. Let's say whenever you're trying to manage your risk, when the catastrophe happens, do you rely in the layout of transferring of risk? Like, let's say you're going from a person to an insurance company, and that insurance company has transferred the risk, and like the top group, is it the government or?
Sometimes the government acts as a reinsurer, right? NFIP is an example. These national programs are insurance. I mean, even not having a proper insurance scheme is the government sort of being your insurer, right? So social, things that happen, right? So FEMA is a type of insurance that you can think of this way, right? FEMA is like this government sort of assistance program, and they work with management and disasters and this kind of thing, and they'll pay out some money for floods or some disaster. And so that's a type of insurance. So does that answer your question? But I guess there's a primary insurer wouldn't, I think, rely on government. That's what
are the leads of all the regulations of the insurer and who just of like catastrophe when it happens, and like who leads the regulations, like to come up with a set of regulation that it has to be done this way, like who are
how the management has to be done?
Yes.
I think that's very city to city, government to government, right? I mean, in the U.S., there's FEMA, I guess, there's much of this. And at the city level, I mean, that's at the federal level, at the city level, at the state level, there's different regulations and managers.
Yeah, it's a patchwork of different regulations, and there's many holes in it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's one of the issues I brought up at the end of my presentation of case studies. I was talking about businesses, but it's also true for governments. Some are doing great, and New York is a real leader, but leader in the U.S. There's other cities and countries around the world that are doing really good work too. But yeah, it's very incomplete, and you see more and more efforts to try to identify good examples and share them. A big one is like Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities campaign, where they've identified the first 33, and now they're about to identify the second group of 33, and just make it really clear that like that these cities, some are rich, some are poor, some are big, some are small, but they all are looking at climate risk and dealing with a long list of issues. And one of them is kind of regulation. So they're doing it well, and we're trying to give them a platform so they can teach their lessons to other places.
Yeah, I think quite a few, Swiss Re has had articles about this, but I'm sure other firms as well. It's this idea of chief resiliency officer, county resiliency officer. This is something that the Rockefeller Foundation, the 100 Resilient Cities is pushing. That's part of their main goal is to have someone dedicated to this risk, overseeing the risk. Right? And so governments are often very fractured, right? So you may have a flood specialist in the engineering department, but he doesn't necessarily talk to some planner or somewhere very often, right?
Yeah.
So there's very much division of this. And I think the idea of this chief resiliency officer, or CRO, or however you want to call them, is to manage this integration as a system.
I have a last comment question. In general, like a comment on the presentation, I found it extremely interesting, and sometimes when you attach these kind of subjects to climate change, what is going to be the application of problems that affect the entire population, the community, society, and business. You know, for example, that there's a stated purpose to evaluating climate change. It's for profit, not just for companies. But you can see, and what I can imagine and analyze in my head, even if their analysis is brought for a business profit, it's still going to improve the actual situation, and it's going to affect the innovation and the technologies to avoid that climate change actually affects the business. And I really find it difficult to see that improvement for the insurance companies, because, for example, the example that you made on the ABC and on the second sector, I said, well, the two maybe not, the quality might not be good, but you do put maybe another two. So what you actually advise the companies and the insurers on that particular case, that particular territory, to cover up your risk might not always be the most innovative solution and the long-lasting solution, but sometimes it's just to put an obstacle to the flood, for example, or to avoid the maximum catastrophe impact. But that is not necessarily the long-term best solution for the territory. Do you take that into consideration, even though your losses might be bigger, because you don't advise a short-term solution? You know what I mean? I mean, the tube that doesn't work, you can put another tube next to it, so you're sure that if one doesn't work, the other works. But you can say, hey, there isn't enough technology for that tube that is a new material, you just have to invest in it, and it will take 2 years to do. So if a catastrophe is coming before the 2 years, well, you will still have to pay. So sometimes, is it the ethical and the one on the long-term project come in the way, or you just make short-term decisions that avoid the maximum?
Well, I mean, right, there's nothing that says you can't do good and do well, right? And so the question, it's really about risk management. And that's sort of...
There's different ways to manage risk.
Sure.
Different situations.
Right, so if the long-term, if I want to be a long-term partner with you, I think I'm... sorry, the insurance firm doesn't want to pay, right? So it doesn't want to pay out. So if I can teach you, if I can show you ways that I know of to make your risk, your premium lower, and reduce your risk, that sort of works out for both, right? So in the end, it's beneficial for insurance firms to teach you risk management, right? And what's actually the best way in the long term and in the short term. So there's
the short term and the long term do not.
That depends on the market, that depends on the CEO, that depends on who's in charge and what the environment is, right? So if it's hard for me to sell insurance because everyone else is selling you insurance, or everyone else is also trying to sell you insurance, then I'm going to say, well, maybe I'll just charge you this next couple of years and then get out. I mean, that's a strategy too, right? But I think there's a long-term advantage, and we both worked out a system that we're both happy with. It's beneficial.
So it's more like developed countries can afford to have insurance on the long term, that can allow them to for the less rich, they can earn insurance that can cover up the damages in the short term that does not allow.
No, I mean, maybe in the short term, right? Maybe in the short term it's better to do something quick, but with the idea that in the long run you're saving money from paying these disasters to do something in the long term. I mean, I think it's very case to case. Hard to say one way or the other. It depends on the market, it depends on the situation, it depends on the client. I think, that's. I think it depends. I think you're right. There's opportunities for insurance.
I think that maybe the risk management in the middle companies and having a lower evaluation of risk management, then so we can do different from management. And well, the insurance, I really don't see sometimes the good and the good part and their role in improving solutions to climate change or just sustainable development.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're right.
I mean, insurance is like a company that just wants to make profit out of it. It just, I mean, in my head, it's just really this, and I think.
Yeah, I don't know. Sure. No insurance.
Do you have cases in which you actually advise, I don't know, a less profitable project, but you know that in the long term it would avoid floods in the next 10 years, or did you just say?
Absolutely.
Put another thing.
There's Swiss Re that works quite a bit with micro insurance for farmers in Africa. I mean, setting this up, right? I mean, there are cases where. Sure. I mean, you hear about you pissed off because your car insurance doesn't pay out when you purchase it, right? I mean, that's very much reality for a lot of people. But there are also examples where you, at least at the reinsurance level, I think Swiss Re, I'm very biased view towards Swiss Re. It's one I really only know, but there are quite a few examples of Swiss Re where they're trying to work. I mean, they're trying to push this idea of working together is better.
Yeah, but it's good for you too, because investing
on
the short term, at a certain point, you wouldn't be able to afford all your clients because the flood would be a national catastrophe around the question, and it won't be available for anybody. It won't be profitable for anybody in 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, so
the policy also is changing, and maybe the risk management brought by Climate can actually add a healthier policy in insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Swiss Re has been around for 150 years, so there must be something they're doing to maintain this. And I think that's part of it, is building a relationship where it's in the long term. I really believe that. I wouldn't say it if I didn't. And I think that insurance very much has a role in the world, and it can do well and good. Maybe not your car insurance, but it.
Here, I saw at the end of your presentation you had some questions you wanted to ask. So,
bring it back up.
For you two, are there any questions you want to ask for the audience?
Oh,
I have one just very quick question, and it's actually to Pierre, so the transition is perfect.
Great.
Pierre, at Climate Science, I know you guys, you enter project bids for governments, you also work with multilateral organizations and their funds, you also work with nonprofit organizations and private companies. So of this broad spectrum of actors that you engage with on a daily basis all across the world, where do you see that things are moving forward the most? Who's being the most proactive? Where do you see hope? This just to give an idea, because like all of us are from different backgrounds, different countries, working in different sectors. So like, where do you see the most development and changes, and are businesses catching up on governments? Because a lot of us have done policy, and a lot of us have been to the United Nations climate talks.
Right.
Like, what's moving faster? What's going backwards? Where should we look to as young students that are going to be entering the job market in a couple of years, or already are for a great number of us?
It's a surprising mix of people who are kind of leading. In the private sector, it's a lot of the bad guys. It's the big oil and gas companies, mining companies. It makes sense because these are the people who build really expensive infrastructure, usually in marginal places like the Canadian North or in the Gulf. where extreme weather happens, climate's changing quickly. These big companies have a lot of money and they build infrastructure that's going to last for decades, and they know the climate's changing, so they're doing a lot of work. Other people who are leading are some of the poorest countries in the world. Bangladesh has been amazing. They have, it's not all climate change, but they've experienced extreme disasters in recent years. And 10 years ago, these were taking thousands of lives. And now they've implemented really smart, early warning systems, which is a great adaptation. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it's saving unbelievable numbers of lives. They've made rapid progress. And a lot of more countries, developing countries, are doing similar work. They're investing in essential infrastructure, they're planning for the future, and they are doing it in a way that is resilient to the best of their ability. So you see a lot of differences and a lot of back and forth, but those are sort of the two main areas where we find the best examples right now, which is kind of a surprising group. The US, though, is really taking off in this area. Europe and UK have been doing a lot. Australia was doing a lot, and they just had a political change. They're not doing much at all. India is picking up speed. But the US is a really exciting place, actually, right now. Obama and Biden's leadership that he's installed in different departments have taken things really seriously. And they are working to build resilience across the entire country in many different ways, large and small. But it's a back and forth thing. Canada was doing well 10 years ago. They were way ahead of the curve. Now with Harper, it's terrible. It's really bad. So it's back and forth. It requires so much political leadership. Bloomberg did so much for New York, and now de Blasio's been really quiet on it. It's not too late for de Blasio. I think he might still do some good work. But without having that political leadership, you're not going to be able to get done the things you need to do, because this requires looking to the future, dealing with uncertainty, getting buy-in on complex issues, and political leadership is just so key. So. Did you want me to go back to those questions, or did you want to ask?
As you wish, there were if you were curious about going with different topics.
Where's everyone from? So, you from the US? No one from the US? Okay. Europe? Africa? Asia? South America? North America, sorry, not just the US, Canada, Mexico?
But it's a lot of Canadians.
No, the girl is not in this one.
She's better agree with me too. Most Canadians.
Yes, you bet, she's really.
Not quite agreeable, I think, in general, right?
Yeah, I mean, these are just more general questions than I guess questions for you guys. But I mean, I do have one general question. I finished my master's 4 years ago, and at the time, I was studying science, studying climate change, and adaptation and resilience, and all these questions were very, very much on the margin just 4 years ago. And that's what I was focusing on. It was hard to find people who were really engaged in it, not only at my own university, but when I go to conferences and meet other people. I'm wondering, for those of you who are recent graduates, has it changed? If you talk about climate change, if you take a climate change class, is it about mitigation or adaptation or both? Is that adaptation now? Is it like an even balance, or is it kind of shifted too far one or the other?
Well, I think it depends where you're studying too, right?
Yeah.
Because there's different areas that are experiencing different things. So then if you study at your national university or whatever, it's a different approach. Like I did my master's in Australia. It was all about adaptation because they've already been experiencing changes in their climate for years. So it's a completely different concept, whereas the rest of the world is just starting to kind of get there.
Right.
So, I mean, in my
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, Australia did so much in the early 2000s. I'm just sad to see them sort of cut back funding now because they're in such a good foundation. That's interesting. The tide is shifting. But
Something else that I've noticed when talking, not necessarily to experts or people that have studied climate change or who work in the field of climate change, is that in a lot of the developed countries, a lot of people will have very vague or wrong notions of climate change, whereas I've been to Nepal and I've been to Bangladesh, and smallholder farmers or fishermen, they all know about climate change, and they all know the right, I mean, the right things. I mean, to a certain extent, obviously they don't have the scope of somebody that studied at university, but strangely, I've seen a much better expertise and more interesting perspectives on the issue of climate change in developing countries and in smaller communities than you see in your everyday life, you know, talking to somebody on the subways or on the bus.
Yeah.
At least to me in the last few years, it's been really, really, really surprising.
Yeah, there's tremendous awareness. But that ties into sort of the top point I have here, how to best talk climate to business. You could say that about anything. How do you talk about climate to a Republican conservative in the U.S.? That's why. Well, that's the thing. If you don't, it's my whole family, and I talk about what I do, and they immediately assume it's political. And I'm like, no, we're just.
Because
It's
they
just
wrap it
fun.
in politics.
Right.
Because it has to do with regulations. It has to do with regulations,
Yeah.
it's not ideology. So it's not as if they don't acknowledge that it's real, it's just that they refuse to equate it with ideology.
Right. And so to figure out how to sort of negotiate that is really tricky. Like there's communities in Florida on the West Coast that are just dealing with so much flooding and so much, and even there's fairly conservative communities. They don't want to talk about climate change. So what my colleague who's working with them has found is we don't talk about climate change. You just talk about it in their terms. For them, it's this flooding that's happening every year, and it didn't happen before, but now it's part of their life. And what does that mean for them? How can they respond to it? And meeting whoever it is you're working with at their level is really crucial. Because ultimately, this and I mean, in some cases, lives are at stake. You know, this isn't just profit and value of companies. This is people's welfare. And if you can find a way to negotiate the climate politics or just get rid of them entirely and just focus on the impacts people are dealing with, it's crucial.
And spinning it in a way that speaks to their experience, right?
Yeah,
That's very much key. In fact, if you come in and tell them that they're wrong because of this, and that, I'm not going to tell you to go to hell, right? Mostly.
Yeah.
But if you tell them, okay, I can, think about this, what's from your experience, from their experience, that very much helps. In any case, right? Anything, teaching, make it relatable.
Absolutely.
Well, that's what the Climate Reality Project, Al Gore's presentation training tries to do, to get local people around the globe to kind of digest all this information and say, okay, well, you're in the business sector, how do you talk to your peers about it? So here's what you need, and then now digest it and learn how you would want to hear about it. And then the same, like you have multidisciplinary. Is that it? Sorry. So then like that you have farmers, you have students, you have doctors, so then everyone can digest the information given, and also according to where you come from. And because obviously in Latin America, for example, we don't have as much denial as just lack of knowledge, because farmers see that the climate is changing, but they don't know why. So obviously we need to change our approach and things like that. So that's like the tool, and maybe that's what people can start doing. So if you know topic, just talk to peers about it.
Yeah.
Just say that
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the Climate Reality Project, but I haven't been in one of their presentations. But it's good to hear that they are doing this. They are trying to gear the message for the audience.
It's pretty cool because it barely has any graphs, which I think people sometimes get lost in them. But you're talking science the whole time. Everything, all information you get, it's science. And you can go and point to the study or whatever if you need to. But you're showing pictures and videos, and people can very easily relate. And whenever we go and do a presentation, they ask us to put in local. So if I were to do it here in New York, I would talk about sand. If I were to do it in Mexico, I would talk about earthquakes, for example, in Mexico City. So you change the framing, and then like that people can see that you're talking to them, not just like if I were to talk about Mexico City here, well, yeah, okay, maybe they might care, but not as much, and they might not be able to relate. It's pretty cool.
All right, well, if any of you don't have any more questions, I'd just like to thank Josh and Peter for their presentation today. We apologize for moving you guys around in 3 different rooms today due to a problem in the schedule. Just to let you know, guys, because this session was moved from the afternoon to the morning, the one on negotiation, the road from Rio to Paris, is going to be held at 4 this afternoon in Hamilton, room 303. I sent an email about that in case you were registered to attend this session. Thank you again.
Thank you.